My name is Mehak Lalani, and I will be moderator for today's Critical Conversation. The Critical Conversations series has been conceived as an ITREB USA initiative aimed at engaging the entire Jamaat, but with a focus on 18 to 40-year-olds. The series aims to explore the critical questions of our time within the context of our faith. Before we begin, I would like to read a land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples as traditional stewards of this land and the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and a way of honoring the Indigenous people who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It is important to understand the long existing history that has brought us to reside on this land and to seek to understand our place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context. Colonialism is a current ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. We would like to open our session today by acknowledging that the land on which I reside is occupied, unceded, seized territory of the Cherokee and Muskogee tribes in the Atlanta area. These tribes have stewarded this land throughout the generations, and we would like to pay our respects to elders, both past and present. We believe the work we do in sessions like these are part of our ongoing responsibility to acknowledge the ongoing harm that is done to Indigenous peoples on these lands and working towards a society that is more just, equitable, and in keeping with our ethics as Ismaili Muslims. During the holy month of Ramadan, we would like to explore today's critical conversation on the topic of exploring the role of arts and culture in Muslim civilizations. Today's session will provide an opportunity for us to explore the importance that arts and culture has played in creating and shaping narratives and preserving histories of Muslim civilizations. During this session, you will also see a Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. You can share additional questions or thoughts during the presentation. We will try to address as many questions submitted during today's talk as we can. With that, let me introduce you to our wonderful panelists briefly. Dr. Ulrike Al-Khamis is a well-known museum professional and academic in the field of Islamic art with over 25 years of experience as a curator and senior advisor for museum and cultural projects. She currently serves as an interim director and director of collections and public programs at the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto, Canada. Before coming to Toronto, she worked as co-director of the Sharjah Museum of Islamic Civilizations, as well as senior strategic advisor to the Sharjah Museums Department in the UAE from 2007 to 2017. She began her career in Scotland, where she worked as principal curator for South Asia and the Middle East at the National Museums of Scotland from 1999 to 2007, and curator for Muslim art and culture at Glasgow Museums from 1994 to 1999. Dr. Al-Khamis holds a PhD in Islamic art from the University of Edinburgh, Scotland, UK. Our next panelist is Professor Nacim Pak-Shiraz. She's on the board of governors for the Institute of Ismaili Studies and holds a personal chair in cinema and head of Department of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies. After a BA in Tehran, she completed a postgraduate program in Islamic Studies and Humanities at the Institute of Ismaili Studies, following by a master's in the anthropology of media and a PhD in film and media at the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS. Professor Pak-Shiraz joined the University of Edinburgh in 2010. Professor Pak-Shiraz is also active on the cultural scene and engages with international film festivals both within and outside of the UK. She has curated 5 annual film festivals in Edinburgh and been a jury member and presenter at a number of international festivals in Europe and Asia. At the outset, we would like to note that the views of our speakers expressed during the course of this discussion are their own. let's turn to our conversation and finally hear from the panelists themselves. Our first question to the panelists is, as we begin, could you please share more about how you've engaged with the world of arts and why did you choose your areas of interest, activity, and research? Professor Pak-Shiraz can start us off.
Thank you very much, Mehak, for that very kind and generous introduction. I would like to thank Farhana as well for this very kind invitation. It's a privilege and honor to be speaking with you, and especially to be in conversation with Dr. Al-Khamis. It's a really interesting story of my own because I came to the Institute, I had a very clear, that's the Institute of Ismaili Studies, a very clear idea of what it was I was going to do after my 2 years at the Institute. As part of the program, after completing our first year, we were sent off to different parts of the Arab world to undertake a summer intensive program there. I ended up in Yemen at the time, and the summer school in which I was studying constituted over 80% of American students. It's interesting, I'm speaking to American citizens or residents today, and that was a very transformative experience for me because they were very keen and were asking about my own experience of being an Iranian woman, and I was very impressed that they knew so much about Iran, only to find out that all of this was based on a film. And that was not without my daughter. And of course, it's a very reductive approach to understanding an entire history and culture and civilization and people simply on one film. And that's where I changed gear, as it were, and I decided to study film. And I wanted to see how it was that Muslims themselves represented themselves. And instead of looking at how Hollywood represents Muslims, which is also a really important aspect. And that's what led me to the study of religion and spirituality in Iranian cinema. I then continued and I look specifically at Shiism within that. And I've since been studying religious epics, Quranic epics, and a number of other fields within cinema itself. Like all my academic colleagues, I teach far more widely, but my area of research remains cinema. So yeah, this is how I ended up doing what I'm doing today, and I'm very, very pleased for that and for that experience I had with those American peers in that summer school.
So much, Professor Nassim. I think it was really nice to hear about your journey and how you, what events shaped for you to be where you are today. So thank you for sharing that. Dr. Ulrike Al-Khamis, we'd love to hear your journey as well.
Yeah, like Professor Nassim, my trajectory really also started through fortuitous encounter, as it were. I mean, I started my studies first in history of art in Germany, and I had always loved art. But then I went to Cairo with my mother to retrace and re-find a long-lost love that she nearly married in the 50s. And I was in my early 20s at the time. I had just started studying in Münster, Germany, and I was completely struck by Cairo, by the people, by the architecture, by the life, by the food, by the noise, by everything. And it changed my life because I came home and I had to study everything that related to what I had just experienced. And I then fought to get support from the German government for a 1-year bursary at School of Oriental and African Studies in London, which is the most amazing college anyone could ever go to. And I relocated. I left Germany, went to the UK to study, fell in love with my husband now of uncountable years, who is of Iraqi heritage, and therefore then immediately really started immersing myself in the living manifestations of what I was also trying to learn and study and research on the academic side. And I then finished my undergraduate. We moved to Edinburgh, where my husband had gotten a position after finishing his studies. I continued with Professor Robert Hillenbrand at the University of Edinburgh to finish my PhD, and then immediately fell, as it were, into my first job at the museum, at Glasgow Museums, which is the largest civic museum organization in the UK. And I was so blessed because the ideology of Glasgow Museums in those days, in the 90s, was already one of diversity, of pluralism, of inclusivity, and stated dedication to the people of Glasgow who pay the museums and their staff to be of service to them. So in this first position, I was immediately enabled and expected to work with the communities. And I really cut my teeth in doing that. And I realized suddenly that I had found my niche of passion. And that was really using museum work in the broadest sense as social work, of fighting for a better community, better inclusivity, better intercultural understanding. And from Glasgow then, as you said, I moved to Edinburgh and continued that trajectory with really focusing my curatorial work on outreach and education, and in particular intercultural education, which in Edinburgh really comprised all the cultures of my geographic remit at the time, which really ranged from Morocco to Malaysia. So it really encompassed a whole host of different communities, cultures, religions, and peoples. And then September 11th happened and everything died. And I had completely lost my purpose because suddenly people's mental doors were shutting down, and all the activities we had been doing and all the positive relationships we had been building with the communities were suddenly considered as being too hot potato to actively continue. So I had a complete lack of purpose. And I remember saying to my professor at the time, if I could pick up my bag and go to the Middle East or somewhere and wipe the blood off the floors in the hospital, I would feel I have more purpose than what I'm doing here in my office researching an Indian textile at this time. So anyway, and then, life happened, and out of the blue in 2007, one of my colleagues in the museum came and told me that there was an opportunity to build or help build a museum service in Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates. And suddenly I thought, oh my God, here is something with a purpose again. Here I can go and kind of work on intercultural dialogue through the arts in all directions. So I packed up my bag, I left my full-time job, my pension, my everything, and went to Sharjah for 10 years to build up the museums there. And then I've been in Toronto since 2017, really the culmination point of everything that I have always worked and fought for. And that is really making the world a better place through museum work, and in my case, through the arts of the Muslim world.
That's so great. And it's so inspiring to hear both of your stories and journeys. And I'm curious, along the way, what did, like you mentioned this idea of like defining things a little bit broader than people normally think. So in terms of Islamic art, how did you begin to define what that means and what it signifies?
Before I went defining anything, I realized that Islamic art is actually a big headache because it is a construct. It was constructed by Western scholars in the late 19th and early 20th century to start with. And it was defined along the way of Western understandings of what was then called the decorative arts and Western paradigms, Western trajectories, and taxonomies. And in the process, the whole discipline was set up in a way that, first of all, really shaved all the intangible dimensions of the material culture of the Muslim world away and focused exclusively on its materiality. It forced objects into exclusively aesthetic and stylistic dialogues without initially at least any interest in how these objects would have been used in their original contexts. And also, as part of the discourse, the Islamic in Islamic art was also relegated to a back room because it wasn't something that Western scholars wanted to engage with. It wasn't their discipline academically, because if you are an art historian, you don't deal with religion or spirituality or poetry or literature or philosophy or anything else. And these things, of course, have improved over the last decades, but fundamentally, we still have a clear disconnect between how Islamic art is seen in scholarship, where it basically means at the highest level, all the material culture from the lands of the Muslim world, from the 7th century to the 19th century, now slowly they are allowing the contemporary dimension into here as well. Talking about material culture that was made by Muslims and non-Muslims, for Muslim and non-Muslim patrons, that functioned within the Muslim world, but also without the Muslim world. And then focuses on particular geographies that reflect directly the areas of influence during the imperialist and colonial period. And because the Anglophone discourses have been predominantly controlled by the French, for example, are not as well represented and integrated into the discourse. The countries that were controlled by the Soviet Union in the past, like including the Central Asian republics, are not really included in the central discourse. Southeast Asia is not included in the general discourse. So we have this mishmash of approaches that really reflect historical political realities in many ways. And then on top of everything, the Islamic understanding of the works that we are dealing with, or the lack of, because some were not at all used in specific religious contexts, or were used by everyone, regardless of religion, is not really examined at all. And so we have a really ongoing problem. And coming back to the materiality that Western scholarship has always foregrounded, it's something that also then has contributed to the subversion of the original holistic understanding of an object. And Professor Nassim will be able to talk about that more, in that the objects from the region would have had an intangible dimension of spirituality, of poetry, of literature, of storytelling, of communal traditions, all of which are lost in a museum case. Whereas Professor Nassim, of course, is very lucky because she deals with a medium that on the one hand continues all these intangible traditions, but then materializes them and visualizes them in a very contemporary and relevant way. So I'm throwing the ball over to you, Professor Nassim, to give us your vision on this unwieldy subject.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ulrike. It is really an unwieldy one. So one of the courses that I teach at the University of Edinburgh is Islam through the arts, because I just find it impossible to be able to define what is Islamic art. And I have a little exercise where I ask them to define what is Islam, and inevitably, of course, we are unable to define that. How would you define Islam? And we come back to what should be a very familiar concept of Islam's with, not a capital I. And then how do you even define art? Because there are the boundaries of what is included. And you're right, we are now dealing with the kind of colonial legacies of where beautiful objects coming from these Eastern lands where people would consider them as Muslim countries, but as you very rightly pointed out, of course, they might have been or by Muslims or not made by Muslim artists. They might have had Muslim artists that were making things for non-Muslim patrons. So it is a very murky kind of place that we're working with. And from there, I start off actually with the voice, and I talk about the first experience, the first Muslim experience that they had was the voice. It was the recitation of the Quran. It was the invitation of the Prophet. And we take it down then to the more recent times of Kulthum as the most wonderful Arab singer, and how she was trained in the recitation of the Quran, and how she takes that training into then the delivery of her own songs, and how it touches a core with people because it comes with this very, very long history and tradition. And yes, that is the immaterial aspect of it, that, when we look at the Quran, for example, in the arts, it's usually in the form of calligraphy, in the form of, we'll see the blue Quran, the famous ones, but that's not the way that actually people related to it in the everyday life. That was just experienced by the very elite, the ones who had the money and the means to actually produce those kind of things. But the Quran was present in the everyday life. It was part of their everyday experience and how it punctuated their lives, whether in the form of hearing the adhan or the call for prayer, or in the form of the recitations of the Quran. So you can see that there is this very different way of engaging with it, where people would look at it divorced from its lived experience, divorced from the traditions that is actually informing all of that. And in my own work, when I'm looking at, for example, cinema, I cannot but take a very interdisciplinary approach to it. So if I'm looking at a very modern, even 21st century, to give you an example, one of the most recent things I'm working on is the film on Prophet Muhammad. It is a film, it's a modern medium, but I have to look at all the other manuscripts and depictions, something that Dr. Ulrike, it is within your domain that I have to now come over to and look at where I can locate, for example, this film of the Prophet within the existing traditions of depictions of the Prophet, and then locate it as something that is not so unfamiliar within Muslim cultures and traditions that even, we've all had some sort of sudden amnesia about the depictions of the Prophet, it appears, because we think it's forbidden and has always been. How has that informed it? How has poetry informed it? How have the stories of Mi'raj informed it? And in the absence of paintings in the way that we know it in the Western tradition, for example, because we have to remember as well, you know, when we look at the Western tradition, when we look at the Judeo-Christian tradition, there is a long tradition of iconography and of the stories, but you have it far less within that. How do these films actually, one of the things I'm trying to argue is they become the first frames of paintings of the events in the life of the Prophet. So kind of looking at the reverse of it happening there. And then of course, yes, I can talk about film forever, but how the medium itself allows both sound and image to integrate, and all of these other stories to narrate something that is very, very familiar in a very new way. And one of the things I also want to remind people is when we're talking about Islamic art, it's not the same as Christian art or Buddhist art. When we think about those concepts, these are very clear iconographies, or we are also familiar with Buddhist art, what comes to mind, right? But with Islamic art, it's just as Dr. Ulrike said, a whole range of things that might start from things that have very sacred purposes. It might be a prayer mat, it might be the Quran itself, to things that have religious purposes, to things that are used as everyday objects. And the concept of art in the way that is defined in the Western tradition, which normally use reference to fine arts, is now in Islamic art, it includes the decorative arts as well, which is not considered to be highbrow in the way that Western tradition defines art. So there are all of these complexities, and I think for us, it is now time for us to say how we want to engage. The terminology is a placeholder. The way I look at it is, people have tried, I don't know, Dr. Ulrike, if you agree, the Islamic art that Karl Ernst uses, or it's stuck. We are stuck with Islamic art. But if you say this is a placeholder, I think we need to now engage with different approaches of understanding Islamic art and seeing how Muslims themselves engage with art. And then just as a little exercise for today, I did a check to see in Persian, Honarhay Islami, so Islamic art, to see if it appears. It has entered their discourse, whereas they never used to refer to their own art as Islamic art. They wouldn't see it as such. This is a label, again, it's interesting, a label given by the West, in which it has now been incorporated, but still as a field of study, not in the way that things are categorized in those countries themselves.
That is such an important point. I love that point, because it really, in a sense, is perverse that the way we today look at Islamic art is through the mirror of Western-centric scholarship. Yes. That paved the path to where we are today. And that is a crucial issue. And the issue of the images of the Prophet Muhammad comes exactly into this. Because when you go back through history into the very diverse spiritual traditions, which then are reflected in the artistic traditions of different regions and religious expressions, then you will find that the way that these images were originally read, and I'm using this word on purpose, was completely different from the way that they have subsequently been positioned. And what we need to get back to is to find a way to recover as much as that is possible through going back to the sources, going back to really asking objects questions, to how these would have functioned in their original contexts. That is absolutely crucial. And, there are historic manuscripts where the Prophet Muhammad is depicted because it is a historical manuscript. It's a work of history. And within that context, his life is described as a man.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, of course, like anyone else depicted, not only him exclusively, everyone is depicted as a ideal marker of a human being.
Are you referring to
not
al-Tawarikh?
Mathalan, yani for example, right?
Yeah.
But it is really taswir al-lugha, the visualization of language. It is never, ever intended as a portrait. Now, if you find the Prophet's image in a spiritual manuscript or a religious manuscript, you will mostly, but not always, find him veiled, referring to the fact that in this particular context, he is looked at as the manifestation of the ideal man, which again is actually a visualized materialization of a spiritual concept within the text. So this is something that never comes out in loudly enough, in any case, in our contemporary scholarship, because again, it is something where you would really need to work interdisciplinarily in an academic environment to actually understand all these subtleties related to the spiritual and poetic and linguistic sophistication that actually underpins the image that appears on the page. It is not an illustration. And it comes back to the connection between the physical and the intangible. And I have to tell you a little story to illustrate that. In Arabic, poetry remains the most popular and most sublime art form. And I'm sure in Farsi, it is exactly the same. And any sophisticated, cultivated person prides themselves in being able to using art, language as an art form, right? And the visual arts that are such a preoccupation in a Western context is secondary, right? Until today in those societies. Now, one thing that reminded me of this discrepancy and this interconnection that we have lost when we look at Islamic art and the visualization of Islamic art today is the following story. I have a very close Iraqi friend, and if her life had gone differently, she would have become an artist. But as it happened, she became a housewife of a wonderful family. And she told me one day that she met a school friend of 40 years ago who always had loved her drawing and her painting because she really is very artistic. And she said, imagine, she remembered a conversation we had 40 years ago. And she said, I still remember this beautiful painting that you painted for me. And Samira said, I never painted you a painting. And she said, of course you painted me a painting. It was beautiful. It was a sunset and it had all these wonderful colors. And Samira said, I never painted you this painting. I described it to you. I wanted to paint it, but I never painted it for you. So the inner image was being drawn through the words was so powerful that in the memory of the friend, it had turned into a physical painting over the years. And that is the same dynamic that informs the translation of an inner spiritual or poetic visualization onto the page of a manuscript. And that is something that has been lost in the way that we conventionally look at Islamic art today. And it is something that I always think about. How do we bring this integral discourse back? Because otherwise you have really, in a sense, you are falsifying the arts of the region by shaving away the most essential aspects of them.
I agree. We could talk about this first question forever, couldn't we?
Yes, absolutely.
Fascinating.
Thank you for sharing. I think the complexity and thoughtfulness with which there's so much behind it, right? And I think you're really helping us unpack so much of this today. And so a follow-up question that I could ask is also about, both of you mentioned the experience of interacting with the arts and the purpose that they hold in the daily life of Muslims. So I wonder if you could, shed some light on, what do you think the role of Islamic art has been in Muslim civilizations in the past and present, and any examples we could learn from your research?
Who would you like to answer this first?
Professor Nassim can start us off, and then Dr. Al-Khamis.
Thank you, Mehak. There are, when we talk about diversity, again, we can look at it in terms of this broad terminology or term of Islamic art. Perhaps I would look at it in a number of ways. One would be the geographical and cultural diversity. So when we talk about Islamic art, in some way or another, we kind of include quite a wide range, and it has its own challenges in that way. But inadvertently, it also forces us to bring together different manifestations, for example, of the Quran from different parts of the world. So I would say perhaps the geographical and cultural diversity, and one of the exercises we used to, as students, have is, Dr. Holden. He has, may his soul rest in peace. He passed away a while ago, but he used to teach us at the institute, and he would show us different manuscripts of the Quran, and we had to go through this game of guessing where it was from. And my favorite ones were from China and from Indonesia, and that was because of the particular way that it had been illustrated. And then you can talk about the diversity of the media, and of course there is a lot of media that is encompassed within this Islamic art category. And that could be, as I said, it's not just architecture or painting or sculpture, that you have a lot of other material arts, decorative arts that come into it. This perhaps could be textile, it could be it could be pottery, it could be enameled glass. So you have a wide range of media that fall within that. And then I think the important one is, perhaps important to this discussion, is the diversity in the social backgrounds. Because again, in comparison to Western or European art, if you look at it, this used to be works that focused primarily on artists, whereas the majority of the arts that are produced in the Islamic lands up until recently are not signed as such, and Dr. Ulrike would be in a better place to comment on that. So I know in the Iranian context, of course, you have Behzad, the artist, and you have Reza, and you have Kamal al-Mulk much later. But generally speaking, we don't know who the artists were, and that is a kind of a difference in terms of it's the art itself speaking, but in bringing it back to the question of diversity, I think because of the decorative arts, It included works that were produced by perhaps lower class people, men as well as women. So even though we don't know who has produced them or created them, but we also become familiar with a quite wide range of them. And we can look at the question of diversity, of course, from so many different angles, but this is something that comes to mind in terms of the geographical and cultural diversity, the diversity of media, and also the social background. And then perhaps we can kind of, Dr. Ulrike, go back and forth on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, to me, as a museum person and a practitioner, the best way is to actually go back to the actual object and ask it all sorts of questions. Because Professor Nassim is totally right that it's obvious that when you look at different areas of the Islamic world, or you look at different periods of the Islamic world, you will see there is a certain diversity in unity. For sure, there are different styles, but what we are interested in our particular context, in particular, is actually the coming together of people and the sharing of what we call Islamic art. Yes, of course, throughout the Muslim world, throughout the centuries, there were many, many different religions and cultures that also did work that's specific to their own community, no doubt. You know, a Coptic Bible would also have been created in Fatimid Egypt, but it's never considered as Fatimid art, which in a sense is ridiculous when you think that these people lived together, worked together, shared in the progression of the country together, and of course in this particular case study were empowered and enabled by the leadership to do just that, right? But here again, academia just cuts things and puts them into boxes so that they never speak together, you know, whereas artisans that were specialized in particular aspects of work, textile making or metal production, right? They would always have continued these specializations within the context of the Muslim world as Jewish communities, as Christian communities, as Mandaean communities, Zoroastrian communities. So when we talk about Islamic art, we are talking about the material culture of the region at large, or at least that is what we should do. Mm-hmm. Yes, there is Islamic art for the ritual. Yes, there is Islamic art that reflects Muslim spirituality in many different ways. And yes, that's exclusive in most ways to the Muslim communities. But there are also loads of artworks and material culture that would have been perused by everybody, you know, but is now essentialized to a manifestation of Islamic art. Mm-hmm. And I have that conversation around our objects in the museum all the time. And actually, I would love to show you one object that gives you a real flavor of how careful we have to be when we define something as Islamic art. Farhana, would you do me a favor and show the last slide in that little presentation that I sent you? Farhana? Oh yeah, wonderful. The last one. Look at this, just to give you an example, okay? The object in our collection is the one on the left. And it is a 16th century Ottoman manuscript from Iraq, Baghdad. Okay, now imagine the following. The leather binding of this manuscript was probably created by Jewish tanners. The paper is marked, and we can identify it as Italian paper. The calligrapher who has written this copy is probably a Muslim, Abdullah ibn Shaq, possibly from Iraq. But the work that this copy encapsulates is from the 11th century and was written by a Christian Nestorian doctor who studied and practiced in Baghdad before leaving to Cairo in 1049. And he then practiced in Cairo and had a disagreement with the Fatimid court physician, had to leave, went to Aleppo, took over the leadership of a local Christian monastery there. Then he worked in Aleppo in 1063 as a hospital physician and died in nearby in 1066. Now, this work in the 13th century, even before this copy was made, was translated by a Jewish translator called Faraj ibn Salem into Latin. And it then became a really fashionable book of good health and well-being. It's called Taqweem al-Sihha, and was distributed all over Europe. So on the right, you can see a copy of a European illustrated text. Now, when you look at this one object, how many different cultures and peoples were involved in its creation, both the intangible dimension of it, if you like, and the materialization of it. So what is Islamic art about this object? Nothing. What it really is a manifestation of the coming together of the experience and expertise of different cultures that then allowed the benefit of this work to grow and to be transmitted, in this case, to Europe. Thank you, Farhana, for sharing. You can take it away now. And that is the fascinating aspect of Islamic art and the potential it has in actually making itself serviceable for everyone and starting conversations that bring people together rather than putting them into boxes.
That's really interesting because it reminds me of one of the arguments I make about what is Iranian cinema when I teach cinema. And is it that the film is made in Iran? Is it that the filmmaker is Iranian? Is it that the producer should be Iranian as well or not? And that's the question I ask of what makes a film about Islam something that we can study Islam in. So I give them an example of certified copy made by the maestro Abbas Kiarostami. He is Iranian. The film happens in Italy. It's based in Italy. The main protagonists are it's Monica Bellucci and I think it happens in France. The main protagonists are Italian and British. The producers are European, and the storyline is something that doesn't have anything about Iran at all. So what do we do with this film? And where do we categorize it? And I think that's something that we really need to seriously think about, because as human beings, we have the tendency to want to categorize things because that is how we make sense of them. Just as in the way that we name things to be able to understand them. And that's one of the first things that you have in the Quran, right? And Adam and God teaches Adam to name things, and that's how he makes sense of it. And we like to categorize it, but we should also constantly be aware of the limitations of our categorization and what does that do. So when you're bringing about this manuscript, I'm like, okay, it's the same question I have. National cinemas are no longer relevant in the way that we talk about, is this Iranian cinema, is this Arab cinema, is this British cinema, for example. And especially it always is when you're referring to the other, you want to categorize them more. It's not a problem about the self. It's not a problem you don't see it in the West. But because you want to categorize the other, you want to make sense of yourself to understand the other, you say, this is this thing. And without any regards to what this is now doing to that thing, what it is. And I really like the phrase you're using, Dr. Ulrike, shaving it off of all that complexity that comes with it, of the spiritual, of the poetic, and all of that significance. Yeah, no, it's very much.
It's really the motivation behind the classification. That's the problematic thing, because you categorize to other. So while you were talking, why does it have to justify itself as an Iranian film, or why does it have to self-classify at all? Why is it not just part of our globalized world's culture and heritage, right? Because the way that we live, and especially nowadays, is a way in which even among human beings, the traditional categorizations don't work anymore. We have an exhibition, a traveling exhibition, which is called Don't Ask Me Where I'm From. And it's 15 contemporary young artists who come from multicultural backgrounds already, now live and work between several countries or continents. And where do you put these people? They are children of the world. They are contributing to the progression of the human experience globally. And if we look at artistic heritage and artistic creation today in this light, then we no longer need these damaging them and us categorizations, because the moment you talk about Iranian film, you would never talk about British film or German film or French film. I mean, rarely. It's kind of all part of, but
those are part of movements, right? Sorry, Ulrike. When they talk about them, they want to talk about a very important point in history. You have the French movement, you have the German cinema. It's an important thing. So it's not to other.
Well, yeah, exactly. The motivation is different, because there is an understanding that there are certain achievements in arts and culture that are acceptable. And then there are certain achievements and in artistic creation that forever have to justify themselves. I had this conversation some time ago with a colleague from Southeast Asia. She's based in Kuala Lumpur, I think. And, she was saying, our contemporary art scene is still emerging, and the Western or the global art scene hasn't taken account. And I said, listen, please, do not talk about an emerging art scene. The art scene has always been there. It is established. It is present. Just because the West thinks it is emerging, don't put on this cap, because it's just every civilization around the world is where it is right now on its own terms, and sadly also on the terms of others. But you can't just have this paternalistic or maternalistic attitude towards other countries and say, oh, you are emerging. It is so condescending. And the same goes for Islamic art, and particularly, of course, how we are grappling with what that means today. Now, when you look at what we have in the museum, most of these pieces that we have are magnificent artistic expressions, but they were never intended to be arts for art's sake, ever. They all had functions in their respective societies. They were serving literally a purpose, right? And of course, now you have your Quran in an app on your iPhone. Mm-hmm. And that too is an artistic and intellectual achievement. Mm-hmm. And it is the natural continuation from the wonderful Quran of the 10th century, the blue one you just referred to, that we have in our case, right? Mm-hmm. We would, of course, never see it like that. And they would crucify me if they heard me speaking like that in art historical circles. But de facto, this is the trajectory. Right, and the new manifestations of painting and cinema and all these things, they are yet again evolving from these rich, sophisticated, mature cultural and artistic traditions of these different locations. And they want to do that on their own terms, but they have forever to justify themselves vis-a-vis this classification system and judgmental system. I remember not so long ago, perhaps 10, 20 years ago, a modern art gallery in the Netherlands said they would never consider contemporary art from the Middle East in their gallery that belongs into an ethnographic museum.
That is very interesting.
You know, so we have to fight through the possibilities that we have been given and through our art and our artworks to actually open up this discourse and make people realize that, we need to become more sophisticated than just continuing with these popular perceptions and notions that are still so very current today.
I have to really put one of my PhD students in touch with you, Dr. Ulrike, because she is looking exactly at that. How is it that contemporary and modern art coming from Muslim lands are not taken up because they don't fall into this kind of exotic idea of Islamic art, and they're not put next to other forms of contemporary art, regardless of how important and what a great achievement they are. They're still, and how difficult it is for them to break through the Western exhibitions, and she's looking at that and the way that they have developed. And it's not necessarily something that has been an imitation of the West, but it's a natural development from within their own context. But in a way, for us, we want to still see them in the same, we want them to have calligraphy, and the modern or contemporary art that has calligraphy, like Shirin Neshat, or gosh, I've forgotten the other lady who does the Moroccan one with henna, and she does, you might know her, Dr. Ulrike. So these are the ones who, Lala, and they are yeah. So they are the ones who are immediately kind of absorbed into Western exhibitions because they still fall into that category, and in a funny way you can relate to them. But if it isn't, these kind of what is so-called Islamic art, and they're just contemporary art, the modern art, they are not considered to be genuine because that is somehow the forte of the West, and therefore there appears not to be enough space to incorporate these developments in other regions of the world. So I will definitely actually put her in touch with you, because this is one of the questions that she is looking at, and I think it's a really important one. And it relates to that, she looks at how female Muslim artists have far more a chance of being exhibited than their male counterparts, whereas the norm in the West is that it's still the majority of them are male artists who get exhibited.
It's unbelievable. And, I think ultimately the only way we can ever resolve this is if we ever came to a point where we actually engage with the individual artistic work and we judge it for its own sake. truly. And it's even the same coming back to museum objects, The Islamic art is in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah.
In some respects, right? And when you look at something, you might get something very powerful out of a historical artwork that has nothing to do with its original context. And that's fine, right? Because again, it can allow you to then open up conversations that take you somewhere and perhaps help you build a bond with somebody you wouldn't have talked to before. And that's an important thing as well. Yeah. But beyond that, by constantly comparing or essentializing, we are only self-limiting. Mm-hmm. And in a way, we are also indirectly supporting the other's discourse. Mm-hmm. Right? Okay. So, and the key is to have the knowledge, to have the creative thinking that goes interdisciplinarily, mm-hmm. To have the courage to invite conversations beyond the expected conversations. Mm-hmm. And also then through the universalities that come out in these kind of conversations, without a shred of a doubt, build the voice. Mm-hmm. Right. And that is what I really am trying to do through the museum as well, because it's about, on the one hand, a healthy, globalized identity building, but at the same time, always being proud of what everyone from wherever they are in the world bring to the table, their languages, their cultural traditions, their spiritual traditions, their roots in whichever countries of the world. All this is a boon. It is not a drawback. It actually is a great, great advantage in devising these enabling and inclusive conversations. And we are lucky. We are lucky through our work, through our life trajectories, and, through the resources we've been given, you as a scholar, me as a museum practitioner. Then we just keep working at it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Al-Khamis and Professor Nassim. Before we head into questions from the audience, which we have a couple, are there any recommendations you would have for the audience about engaging in further study of Islamic art?
It really depends what the ultimate aim is. Because you could study Islamic art because you want to know more about it and you want to have all the facts, etc., etc. But as you just heard, just imbibing the facts that are available in the current literature, inadvertently you might end up in a place where you just reiterate the narrative without being in a place where you can challenge the narrative and open up the narrative. But if you are interested in Islamic art as a vehicle for intercultural conversations, for highlighting inclusive issues of diversity, and so on, then the way to do that is actually to really think in a 360-degree fashion. And when you look at an object, you think, who designed this? Who built this? Who brought the materials? Who calligraphed this? Why was this quote chosen? How might this have traveled? Who might have used it? So to ask an object as many questions as you can possibly ask it, and then look for the answers. And look for the answers in religious studies, in literary poetic studies, in Islamic studies, in economic studies, in social demographic studies. Then you will get a phenomenal picture that will completely subvert the one track narrative we have at the moment. It will bring to the fore the crucial importance of non-Muslim cultures and communities that have always contributed across the region and continue to do so despite all the challenges. It will help build capacity in your own communities, because these conversations have to be held within Muslim communities as well as in the broader playing field. So yeah, that's my general guidance.
Thank you, Dr.
I would agree with Dr. Ulrike. I would also suggest a really useful website, Khamseen, that has been put up, and they have very short presentations on various aspects of Islamic arts. These ones range between 7 to 15 minutes, and you can pick what you're interested in. I don't know if I can put it in the Q&A chat here, or if I can send it to Mehak and Farhana, and then you can share it with everybody. I don't seem to be able to put it. I put it in the chat, I guess. I can't put it on the Q&A. And then we can share it with everybody.
In the chat, if we put it to all panelists and attendees, then all of the attendees will be able to see it as well.
I have put it there, so you can have a look at that. I was just looking for it as Dr. Ulrike was talking. I find that as a really good resource to use, and you can kind of go through them and see which ones you're interested in.
Thank you so much for all of these really reflective thoughts. And I think just the way that you helped us understand what Islamic art means, what's the complexity behind even using that word to describe how it limits and in what ways it limits different Muslim civilizations and societies and how they've engaged, and even this idea of like even non-Muslims and how they've engaged in those societies and their representation in this in Islamic arts. And so I think we've walked away with a really good understanding of the nuances behind using that word and how careful we should be, and the tools and questions we should think through when engaging with any sort of Islamic art again. So thank you so much for that. And we have a couple of questions for the audience. So from the audience, our first question is, how does attention to the intangible knowledge wrapped up in material cultures that can be used by all find a place in arts education, especially in Western school contexts? What would be your vision for arts education in plural societies globally?
I would say start with the us rather than the them and us. You can use any museum, any object in our museum, for example, by simply starting a conversation about what do you see, what are your associations around it, what stories do you think can be told using this object. We just had a school exercise with students over one of our tiles with two Mongol gentlemen having a conversation, and the school did storytelling around this tile, and the stories that came back were absolutely amazing. So I think it's really important to give students to do something together and then allow them to bring their different perspectives to the table in doing so. So, for example, nowadays, we all worry about climate change. We all worry about water issues, for example. So by having a common goal or a common concern, and then bringing case studies from the various cultures and religions to the table and how they engage with this or have traditionally engaged with it, will be really empowering, thought-provoking, and will end up in an act of sharing as well, because in addition to the commonalities, the specificities will also come out, but in a kind of inclusivist way. So that would be my recommendation, because ultimately everything we do is aimed at bringing people together and bringing and building positive, committed intercultural societies. And I think through our various ways of working, the urgency of doing that is increasing by the day, because I think the crisis has really, really shown us that the fractures in society, wherever we are increasing and are really, really cracking further as we speak. So our thinking around how we can engender inclusive, empowering conversations around the arts we are dealing with is extremely, extremely important.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Khamis. Professor Nassim?
I agree completely with Dr. Ulrike, and one of the things that I have done and found it very rewarding is screening of films for school children at the film house that we had here. I have to say, I didn't arrange for that. I was just invited to come and speak with them. And I could see how, through the narrative, through the medium of film, it wasn't that much the context and the people were not alien to them any longer, that they could connect with them and relate with them on a very human level. And you could pick the universality between between the characters and themselves in a way that perhaps moves beyond the kind of regular boundaries and barriers that we see. So that is one of the other things. And especially, I think, children and adults are increasingly becoming more and more users of the visual media. And visual media is going to play a really important part in the way that we're going to understand the world around us. And we need to utilize that. I've used the example of cinema. Dr. Ulrike has used the example of objects. We can expand this to all forms of art, I would say, whether it is, I can see that the question is from Hussein John Muhammad, who I know works in music himself. So, and the kind of work that he does in bringing people together across different traditions, it needs to be a multi-pronged approach to it. And it, as Dr. Ulrike said, we need to understand the world as a global world and try and overcome these boundaries of us and them, and show the artificiality of those, because those are really fragile boundaries. Because even when we draw those boundaries and we are in the us group, we can create so many other boundaries amongst ourselves. And sometimes the similarities between somebody who is within this category and another one who's outside might be far greater than those within the same category. And it is going to take a concerted effort on everybody's part. But the first step in it is awareness, I think, and then action, and you get everybody's buy-in.
Another question our audience posed is that there's a quote attributed to Prince Amin suggesting that much of the art of Islam is very simple and very linear, not charged and heavy in that sense. And in that sense, it ties in well with much of the Western modern aesthetic. Can you explain what this means, and do you agree with this characterization?
Again, we have a comparison between Western art and Islamic art. And of course, it's perilous to compare, because the artistic expressions of a culture are, in the very first instance, unique and inherent to that particular culture. And then, of course, it evolves and it also interacts and responds to impulses coming in from other cultures and civilizations. I think the emphasis on the simple and the linear comes from an inherent understanding within Islamic philosophy that the creation of the universe and the the eternal continuation of the universe, reflects the perfect order created by the divine. And this perfect order is based on geometric principles. And of course, there are many, many ways in which geometry is externalized and made visible within the Islamic arts, whether that is in the design of buildings or the interior design to decorate these buildings, whether it is in the way in which designs are planned out within artworks or in manuscripts. It is reflected in the geometric patterns of poetic meters, of musical meters, which in turn reflect the poetic meters. So there is a sense in creation that everything follows an inherent order. And because the arts in the Muslim world, as I said, traditionally until the early modern period, all had a function rather than were created for art's sake, there was no need for flourishes. They were just superfluous, they were unnecessary, and they were also in many ways frivolous. And the Baroque aspects really only come in by the, let's say, 18th, 19th century under the influence of, again, Western tastes, which were then considered as being all the rage, and of course, particularly and in the royal and upper class elite circles, one wanted to be seen as keeping up with the Joneses, and then introduce these kinds of elements into one's material culture. But the interesting thing is, if you go beyond the royal and elite contexts and you look at the more ordinary members of society, and I think that goes to this very day, you will find that these Baroque extensions are perhaps much, much less evident, because there you still find kind of an adherence, at least in general terms, to some of the fundamentals of aesthetic and cultural preoccupations that we've seen over many centuries. But I hope that answers the question.
Professor Nassim, would you like to add anything?
I think that was a very extensive response. Nothing more to add, really.
Well, thank you so much for, shining so much light on us and providing us with so much knowledge and context and just background of this topic. We really appreciated that. So thank you to both of you, Dr. Ulrike and Professor Nassim. Thank you, audience, for joining us today. Hopefully, this is just a start of this critical conversation. Today was such a treat for me, and I hope it was for you as well. Thank you, everyone. A couple of announcements before you go. We've pasted a link in the chat really quickly. If you want to view any past critical conversations or the recording of this one, please visit the Facet of Faith page on the website. The link is in the chat, and then please look out for more information about on social media and on the Smiley website for more critical conversations and young adult conversations in this next coming weeks and month. Also, please take the survey at the end of the session that will pop up on your screen before you head out, just so we know how we can get better in the format of these critical conversations. And thank you, everyone. And Yali Mudat.